Hey folks, I've been workshopping a video about Cascade for a while, and it just hasn't really gotten to a point I've been satisfied with. I don't feel like I have enough to say exactly to turn it into a public video. So I'm just going to lay out my thoughts here and go over what I think about it. And maybe this stuff will make it into a future video, maybe it'll become its own video in the future, maybe it won't, who knows. But I'm just going to share some thoughts I have about Cascade, or put a different way, the problem with Cascade. Now, Cascade is maybe a weird thing for me to be dunking on here, because I have a Cascade deck. I like my Cascade deck. It's a fun deck. I understand the various appeals that Cascade has for people, and at the same time I feel like those appeals are intertwined with some serious problems with the mechanic. So I'm going to be talking about these things together, and this is going to be divided into two major points. The first major point is that Cascade adds variance, put simply. If you cast a 6-mana Cascade card, it can hit a 5-mana card, and it can hit a 1-mana card. This is not a good or a bad thing necessarily, it's just a fact about the mechanic. It adds variance to the game. Now, there is an added spice to this increased variance, something that people like about it. In my Rata deck, I enjoy the increased variance. The deck is built in a way where a lot of things are pretty boring or low variance. The commander is a 2-mana mana dork. The deck is filled with a whole lot of 4-mana ramp. And having Cascade kind of be this wild card of, oh, will it do something that I really want? Will it do something that I'm a little bit less happy about? I think that's really cool. The deck is well oriented to work with Cascade because it kind of minimizes the swinginess of the mechanic and pairs it with a deck that does something very mundane and simple otherwise. However, in the context of EDH as a whole, this is a little bit different because it is adding variance to a high variance format. EDH has 4 players. It has 100-card singleton decks. Most decks are very complex. They might have plan A, plan B, plan C. They might have all sorts of little side synergy packages and just lots of moving parts to keep track of and things that add little extra spurts of variance throughout the game. And Cascade adding variance to that absolutely will have an impact. If you think about something like Apex Devastator or Maelstrom Wanderer, you drop one of these cards, they might win the game on the spot through if you hit powerful cards, but they can also hit a ramp spell and a protection spell and then not do a whole lot. Now, the question of variance in EDH is a complicated one because obviously people will have different preferences for how much variance they want, how much variance they're okay with, what sort of format they want to play. And also, variance is inevitable on some level. I listed several ways that EDH just naturally kind of has a lot of variance. At the same time, I think it's worth asking the question whether adding additional variance to that is a worthwhile thing, or whether that should be something that's not as encouraged, if a mechanic like Cascade shouldn't be as encouraged in a format like EDH, through card design is what I mean by that. Now, I did talk about protection spells. What if you hit a protection spell? And that brings me to my second point, which is the effect that Cascade has on situational cards. And my point here is simple. Cascade discourages these. It discourages situational cards, and it specifically discourages ones whose effect is instant speed and where that instant speed is relevant, such as a counterspell. It likewise encourages modal cards, or cards with a lower alternate cost, or cards which are cast in advance of their effect happening, like maybe there's a creature with an effect stapled to it in some capacity. And this incentive can actually manifest in some pretty interesting ways. So my friend Hans built a Yidris deck quite a while back. The end product of the deck wasn't very successful to his ends, but I think it had some very interesting card choices. It had stuff like Spellskite, Unsubstantiate, Simic Charm, Malevolent Hermit, things where, if you hit it off of a Cascade, even though the intended effect of the card is to do something at instant speed, if you hit it off of a Cascade, it's not going to be dead. Either you'll have some different effect, or you can save that protection for later. And I think that's kind of neat. Likewise, my Rata deck has lots of removal that is stapled to creatures in some capacity. And it also is built in a way where it has absolutely no need for protection spells. And in that way, it works quite well with Cascade. So there are obviously these ways where you can deck build around this, and it can act as a deck building limitation, which I think can be quite interesting in some cases. It can be kind of fun to build around a limitation. However, I think it's worth asking whether that's genuinely interesting more broadly, and whether that kind of added deck building novelty is worth the downsides I mentioned, or the perceived downsides of discouraging situational cards and adding variance. I can think of lots of decks where the process of building the deck is very cool. You're navigating around some sort of deck building restriction, but where the end product isn't actually that interesting. For example, my friend Connor built a Volo deck, and the process of finding all these creatures of different types to work in the deck was probably undeniably a fun thing, but in practice the deck wasn't all that interesting because all that kind of deck building intrigue didn't translate into interesting gameplay. And I can think of lots of other examples of that as well. I laid out one in my video about my Arkelos deck. So I think these kind of deck building challenges don't necessarily lead to interesting gameplay. And I think it's also worth asking the question of whether players will even engage with these deck building limitations. Somebody might add in all of this protection and removal that is carefully picked out not to clash with Cascade in any way, but they also might just choose to run less protection and removal. And I think that's a worthwhile consideration as well. Is this just pushing people to run decks that are less interactive and just kind of do their own solitaire, steamroll, snowball type of thing? I think those type of decks are generally less interesting. And if Cascade promotes that sort of deck, I don't think that's good. I can't really do a full discussion of Cascade without talking about Discover. And I see Discover as being Wizards of the Coast's attempt to fix some of the problems with Cascade, because it allows you to put the card into hand rather than casting it immediately. It's a thing you can choose to do. And though it doesn't totally fix the problems with Cascade, obviously there's still mana loss if you choose to put a card into hand rather than being able to cast it immediately. You still have to pay for the card later, but it at least lets those cards not be dead if they're super situational. And in addition, I think it also helps out with the variance problem. If you have a card that's generally more situational and a little bit weaker, at least you can cast it at the optimal time rather than having it just be kind of dead or almost dead. So I was actually really excited to see Discover be printed, and I was excited to see Wizards of the Coast fix this problem that I had with Cascade. The issue is, Wizards of the Coast has kept printing Cascade cards. They printed Smoldering Stagecoach in Outlaws at Thunder Junction. They printed Bloodbraid Challenger in Modern Horizons 3, though I was willing to write that off as kind of an homage to Bloodbraid Elf. And they also printed Wildseer, Scouring Maw, most recently in Bloomborough Commander. They also printed Monstrous Vortex in Modern Horizons 3, a Discover card. And all of that just kind of leaves me wondering, what's going on there? What's the thought process here? Because I don't think that Discover is inherently tied to Ixalan. I don't think it's a super flavorful keyword. Hearthstone, as an example, literally printed Discover as a keyword in kind of an exploration-based set, or exploration-themed set, and then people liked it so much that they made it evergreen. So obviously that's not Magic the Gathering, but it's not a particularly kind of intense, flavorful term. You're discovering a card out of your deck. And so I'm kind of just left wondering what's going on there. What's the thought at Wizards of the Coast? 2025 Snail here. I'm cutting the last minute and a half of this video because it is now pointlessly out of date. That is because, much to my own satisfaction, we have seen no new Cascade cards since the publishing of that bonus video, and we have seen 2 new Discover cards. These both are somewhat themed around the concept of discovery, at least from what I understand about Aloy as a character, but I'll be curious to see if this is a pattern going forward. Will Magic go the way of Hearthstone in making it truly evergreen? Will half of all cards be slot machines that spit out other cards? Remains to be seen.